Welcome to the third video. Now that we're aware of what we are to be mindful about with regard to the witchcraft of Medusa, I would like to share with you the parallels I found between the narrative of Medusa and the biblical account of Lot's wife. The Lord instructs us to be mindful of Lot's wife at this time. Medusa resonates with Lot's wife, who turned into stone after disobeying God and lingering behind her husband, after her physical rescue from sudden death had already commenced by direct and divine intervention. Lot's wife, nonetheless, looked back upon the harlot city, which is a Medusa-type stronghold in her life. We read about that in Luke 17, and the life she was called to leave behind her, and as judgment petrified into stone. Walking behind Lot, her husband may not have noticed her lingering, nor discern her heart's true desire, but the Lord did, however, and acted accordingly. He warns us in the scriptures to be reminded of her. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day he which shall be upon the housetop, and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away. And he that is in the field, let him likewise not return back. Remember Lot's wife. Whosoever shall seek to save his life shall lose it. Whosoever shall lose his life shall preserve it. I tell you, in that night there shall be 2 men in one bed, one shall be taken, the other will be left. So like Andromeda, Lot's wife was set free, well on her way to safety from sudden destruction, but she remained entangled with her former life, and after backsliding and acting out spiritual disobedience, her unsevered ties of entanglement became her downfall. So we see that reflected over here in what is known as a tourist site of the Pillar of Lot's wife, but also reflected in the iPad code as the stronghold of the harlot city, and the reflection of Lot's wife gazing upon that city, turning into petrified stone. So such commands towards our sanctification and holiness as these are given to those who, through grace, are delivered out of a sinful state and condition. We are not to return to sin and Satan, nor rest in our own works or the world, but reach toward God and heaven, and neither stay or linger in the plain. Genesis 19. For that is escaping to the mountain before we must not stop. So, contrary to the Lord's instructions, Lot's wife did linger. She backslid, she hardened in her sin, and ultimately her heart, which had been turned from stone into flesh upon her salvation and rescue, turned back into a hardened state, ultimately into stone, when her disobedience was judged. So the Lord calls us to be mindful, not to harden our hearts against Him, and allow the Spirit to work in our life, in our minds, in our hearts, to remain soft and open towards His leading. And what a hardened heart can bring forth, related to the Antichrist, can be visualized over here. So we see a depiction of the Chinese terracotta army. It's an necropolis, it's a tomb setting, and we see how in the iPad code we see the Antichrist rising from a similar stronghold of stone, reflecting those dead in their trespasses. He is masked as an angel of light, but as a Judas goat, so coming from people's midst, he rises up to their destruction. And one of these satanic mouthpieces, which will be brought forth and out of the midst of the people, we see reflected over here, a prince to be brought forth on the world stage beyond his current ceremonial capacity, after the church and society at large have crumbled under the weight of sin, reflected in the destruction of the spire of what we now know was the spire of the church of the Notre Dame. rising from the transformative cave to become a satanic co-regent, acting out a lifelong programming as him being a king of hearts. Being unrestrained, we see a crowning reflection, and him being unrestrained, he's losing the crown of thorns. So my research shows that Prince William will be preceded by the first beast, Obama, and flanked by the Pope as the second beast, or false prophet, and hidden in plain sight, the iPad goat shows all three of them. So we also, during the Super Bowl halftime show, were shown the hybridized Antichrist rising amidst a pandemic and medical martial law, and again in plain sight. So acted out on the world stage in Italy last week as well, we see a revisitation of the Black or bubonic plague, originating from the same region in China as COVID-19. And we also see how the ancient plague doctor was placed center stage again in both in new and a familiar suit. So this plague doctor was not just reflected in the iPad goat, but was actually walking the streets of Milan and Venice the last week. So Milan hosted a fashion week, a biannual fashion week, endorsed by many satanically inspired fashion houses who are broadcasting the elites' New World Order agenda and ideals and fashion ideals. It was cut short, and the Venice Carnival was cancelled as well. So these are two locations which are very rich in prophetic meaning, and the street scenes and the masking of people was predictably programmed in the fashion shows of last year. This one by Dior, this one by Gucci, even portraying severed heads, pointing forward to Revelation 20. And the Venice Carnival last year, we saw how they predicted the coming of the year of the rat, trekking back to the plague, and the beast rising from the sea. So if we look back at the history of Europe, this plague doctor, in addition to European town criers, like in Milan, were in the streets chanting, "Bring out the dead," while they were dragging trailers of piled up infected corpses of people. And we've seen them acting that out in Venice again the past few weeks. So the next segment is entitled Flawed Masks and Suits. And we may recognize what was happening historically is now reenacted in our days. The plague doctor was willing to venture into plague-stricken areas and tally the number of dead. After more than 250 years fighting the plague, hope did finally arrive with the invention of the 17th century equivalent of the hazmat suit. Unfortunately, it didn't work very well. The primary responsibilities of a plague doctor were not to cure or treat patients. Their duties were more administrative and laborious as they kept track of casualties of the Black Death, assisting in the occasional autopsy or witnessed wills for the dead and the dying. Unsurprisingly, this meant that some plague doctors took advantage of their patients' finances and ran off with their final will and testament. More often than not, these bookkeepers of the plague were revered and sometimes even held for ransom. Hired and paid by local municipalities, plague doctors saw to everybody regardless of their economic status, though they did occasionally invent their own cures and tinctures, which they included with a fee for wealthier patients. So here we have a modern and ancient depiction of the hazmat suit. So by the time of the 17th century, physicians had subscribed to the theory that the plague was spread through foul-smelling air. But prior to this time, plague doctors wore a variety of protective suits but it wasn't until 1619 that a uniform was invented by Charles de Lorme, the chief physician to King Louis XIII. The suit had nostril holes in the plague doctor's mask, which certainly didn't help to protect the doctor. So the nose is a half-foot long, shaped like a beak, filled with perfume, and under the coat we wear boots made in Moroccan leather, goat leather, and short-sleeved blouse in a smooth skin. The hat and gloves are also made of the same skin, with spectacles over the eyes. Because they believed that smelly vapors could catch in the fibers of their clothing and transmit the disease, Delorme designed a uniform of waxed leather coat, leggings, boots, gloves intended to deflect the particles from head to toe. The suit was then coated in sweat, hard, white animal fat to repel bodily fluids. The plague doctor also donned a prominent black hat to indicate that they were in fact a doctor. The doctor carried a long wooden stick which he used to communicate with patients, examine them, and occasionally ward off more desperate and aggressive patients. By other accounts, patients believed the plague to be a punishment sent from God and requested the plague doctor to whip them in repentance. So here we see how they, in that time, in the 16th and 17th century, depicted the angel of death flying over, bringing pestilence, and how we are doing it right now. So the article on plague doctors continues. Foul-smelling air was also combated with sweet herbs and spices, and that was stuffed into a mask with a curved bird-like beak. Sometimes the herbs were set aflame before they were put into the mask so the smoke could protect the plague doctor. They were also wearing glass goggles. A hood and leather band tethered the goggles and masked tightly to the doctor's head. Besides the sweaty and horrifying exterior, the suit was deeply flawed in that it had air holes poked into the beak. And as a result, many of the doctors contracted the plague and died themselves. So, strikingly, the word quarantine can actually be traced back to Milan and Venice, as in 1374, the Duke of Milan drew up an edict mandating all those suffering from plague to be taken outside the city to a field or forest until they either recovered or died. But the word quarantine comes from a 17th century Venetian variant of the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, the period that all ships were required to be isolated before passengers and crew could go ashore during the Black Death plague epidemic. So we see the world elite currently having copied even this portion of the Black Plague history to transport their weaponized biovirus by ship. The practice of quarantine is known much longer. We know it from the Bible. An early mention of isolation occurs in the book of Leviticus, describing a procedure for separating infected people out of the healthy people to prevent the spreading of disease. So this is a depiction how a woman suffering from the contagious disease of syphilis was quarantined, being fumigated in a special oven. The caption above the oven translates as, "For one pleasure, 1,000 pains." And I believe this is the practice and depiction the makers of the iPad goat have used to symbolize the hardened prison of the old harlot. The enemy's modern depiction of Madame Q, Q as in quarantine, the mind-controlled or once chained princess, has hardened in her sin to become an old harlot paying her dues, and now she is reflective of Mystery Babylon the Great, who is going to be judged shortly. So thank you for watching part 3 of this video. I'm not going to be able to finish it within 3, so there's going to be a 4th part with more enemy signaling and the crowning of the Antichrist that the elite are preparing towards. Hope to see you there.